Shri Narendrabhai Modi, Chief Minister of Gujarat, on this talk hosted by the Friends of BJP Gujarat Chapter. We are going to today discuss the growth model of Gujarat and its sustainability, and the talk is going to be given by Shri Bibek Debroy, who is currently a professor with the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, and among his various achievements, he has been a consultant to many government and non-governmental organizations from time to time. He's also been an editor with the Business Standard, and he's also today a columnist as well as a consulting editor with the Economic Times. Welcome to the show, Mr. Debroy. May I ask Pooja to... Oh, thank you so much.
Friends of BJP.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So Vivek, I'm not going to waste time in any other formalities. I would straight away ask you to speak for some time, give your views on your research and study that you have done on Gujarat. At the outset, I would, for the sake of formality, I would like to that while this program is being hosted by the Friends of the BJP in honor of Shri Modi ji's birthday, Mr. Debroy is in no way connected with the Friends of BJP or the BJP, and his views are his own and independent and do not necessarily reflect the views of either the Bharatiya Janata Party or Shri Narendra Modi on various topics that we might be discussing today. So may I ask you to give your talk, and then perhaps we can do some questions later on?
Yes, thank you, Devang, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for warning me that these flowers might be taken back. And welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and whoever else may be watching. I am not a Gujarati, nor do I live and work in Gujarat. That has pluses. It also has minuses. Hopefully the plus is that if you are distanced from the state, you tend to have a distant kind of view which enables you to be somewhat less emotionally attached. The minus, of course, is that if you are an outsider, you may get all kinds of things wrong. What I initially thought I'd do is, because this is meant to be an interactive session, is initially talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, if that is fine by you, Devang,
yeah.
And then we take questions, comments, and have the interaction. In those initial 10 or 15 minutes, I want to convey the big picture. I deliberately do not want to get bogged down in data, nor do I want to get bogged down in details of individual schemes. If you want to do that, we can come back and revisit that later on. To me, the starting off point is the following. No one deliberately wants to remain poor. Particularly if you are in the working age groups, if you are not old, if you are not disabled, you are never voluntarily and willingly poor. Everyone wants to better their lives. However, to better your life, you need certain things that are essential prerequisites. And some of these things that are essential prerequisites are things that are not quite private goods because there are market failures, and therefore you want the government or you want the state to deliver those things. Examples of that might be law and order. Examples of that might be physical infrastructure in the nature of rural schools, in the nature of primary health centers, in the form of rural roads. Some of it may even be social infrastructure in terms of primary health centers, rural schools, things like that. All of these come under the overall umbrella of what people normally describe as governance. So therefore, if one looks at a model for development, one is trying to ensure an environment where there's high growth so that that growth trickles down, and simultaneously one wants to ensure that there is a public sector which makes the public expenditure in the areas that have market failures, and that public expenditure is efficient transparent, and leads to improvements in outcomes. Stated thus, this model of development is no different from the general template of development anywhere in the world, and is no different from the template of development in any particular state of the country. Except to my mind, Gujarat is the only state which has implemented this particular template of governance. Let's first begin with the growth story. And the growth story, of course, is that since the beginning of the 10th five-year plan, I'm talking about the year 2002, Gujarat has registered a gross state domestic product growth rate in real terms, annual average of more than 10%. I'm using the deliberately vague expression more than 10% because depending on how you do averages and things like that, you will differ on the second decimal point or the first decimal point. But the fact of the matter is that Gujarat has delivered this kind of high rate of growth. Do remember that as levels of economic development go up, it becomes more and more difficult to sustain high rates of growth. So it is somewhat unfair to compare what Gujarat has done to the rates of growth in smaller states which are completely different, like let us say Puducherry or Goa or Delhi, and even to some extent it's unfair to make comparisons with a state like Bihar where the slack has been much more. One can validly make comparisons with states like, let's say, Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra. And this 10%, mind you, 10% plus, mind you, is higher than the all India averages by a considerable magnitude. The next question to ask is, there is this perception that much of this growth in Gujarat, and I'm using the word perception, has been driven by industry. The vibrant Gujarat kind of model. The fact of the matter is that that's not quite true. In fact, manufacturing share in GDP in Gujarat has actually dropped. A large part of the Gujarat growth story has been an agriculture growth story, and agriculture in Gujarat over the last 10 years has grown pretty fast. There is a reason to flag this agriculture growth story, and that reason is much of the poverty in India is essentially a rural sector phenomenon. So if you can boost agricultural rates of growth, if you can ensure transformation in the rural areas, you are going to get significant drops in the poverty numbers. Since I've mentioned the poverty numbers, let me also mention that unfortunately we don't get data on poverty every year. The large sample NSS surveys surface roughly once every 5 years. And the last two sample surveys that we have, courtesy the NSS, are from 2004-05 and 2009-10. And if you look at these figures, 2004-05 and 2009-10, I'm not giving you the exact figures. As I said, I want to avoid the figures because I want to give you the broad picture. You will find that yes, poverty has dropped in Gujarat, but what is more remarkable is that the rural poverty in Gujarat has dropped sharply between 2004-05 and 2009-10. The drop in rural poverty is much more than the drop in overall poverty. Quite often there is a suggestion that yes, look, growth has happened, yes, poverty has dropped, but what about inequality? Isn't it possible, at least hypothetically, that the benefits of this growth are not evenly distributed? That's of course unlikely given what I've said about the agricultural growth story, given what I've said about rural transformation. And again, I'm not giving you the figures, but if you look at the inequality numbers, you do not find any dramatic increase in inequality in Gujarat between 2004-05 and 2009-10, certainly not in rural Gujarat. Let me now step back a bit and ask, what do you think people need in terms of an enabling environment? I think the first point to flag is what people need are roads, electricity, and water. And in my view, one of the reasons behind this remarkable transformation in Gujarat, particularly in rural Gujarat, has primarily been because of electricity and because of water. Roads have always been generally good in Gujarat compared to many other states, but they have also improved. But fundamentally the difference has happened because of assured supplies of water of both the drinking kind and the irrigation kind, and also of electricity. People often say that yes, Gujarat has done all of these things, there is growth, yes, there is the agricultural growth story, but what about the social sectors? What about things like health? What about things like education? In areas like these, Gujarat has not done that well, at least so runs the perception. One of the reasons for this perception is twofold. Firstly, data on the social sectors that people use to make comparisons are often dated. That's true of health, that's also true of education. Secondly, if one looks back at the last 10 years, there is the 10th plan period between 2002 and 2007 and the 11th plan period between 2007 and 2012. Much of the focus in social sectors in Gujarat happened in the course of the 11th five-year plan. And again, I'm not going to give you specific schemes, I'm not going to give you specific numbers, but there have been specific interventions which have sharply led to increases in institutional delivery. They have led to declines in dropout rates. They have led to increases in enrollment rates, particularly for girls. And some of this is certainly going to be reflected when we have more and later and subsequent data on the social sectors. But what's even more important, and I come back to the issue of governance, is improving the delivery. Essentially, several things have happened insofar as the delivery is concerned. Firstly, there has been an empowerment of the bureaucracy. And I'm sticking my neck out and saying there has been an empowerment of the bureaucracy in the sense that the bureaucracy has been insulated from political interference. And the bane of bureaucratic delivery in any state in India is political interference, be it in the nature of transfers, be it in the form of postings. And one singular achievement that I can see, and as I said, I'm sticking my neck out in Gujarat, is this empowerment of the bureaucracy. The second thing that has happened is a very conscious attempt at decentralization of planning. And I can give several examples of this, but essentially what has happened is two different things. Firstly, the administrative system, the bureaucratic system has been taken down to the grassroots level, and simultaneously there has been an upward feedback loop from the beneficiaries to the planning system so that people are more aware of their rights. So therefore, in any process of development, there is a role for the state and there is a role for the private sector. What I am trying to say is that the role for the state has become more efficient, public expenditure has become more efficient, and there have been several state-level schemes which are intended to plug the gaps in central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. And simultaneously, the space has been vacated for the private sector. I don't necessarily mean only the private corporate sector. It also means the private non-corporate sector. It includes NGOs, and there are several instances of what can broadly be called PPPs, not just in infrastructure, in physical infrastructure, but also in the social sectors. I'm nearing the end of my initial presentation, but stated thus, you can see that this is a broad template of governance and development that ought to have happened in any state in the world. So is there a Gujarat model of development? At one level, not really, because this is a standard model of development that any state should have developed and implemented. However, it's a Gujarat model in the sense that no other state has actually managed to quite successfully do this. So therefore, is it a model that ought to be replicated? Of course, yes. Let me now stop those initial remarks of mine and we will come back. Thank you once again, Devang, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Vivek, for your wonderful initial talk. I just have one question before we go into a break, and then we'll take some questions and interact with the viewers. You at some stage said that the rural growth is in fact more, the agricultural growth is more than the manufacturing growth, and in fact the manufacturing growth has gone down a little bit. As you know, the state government has put a lot of effort in the Vibrant Gujarat Summits and has been trying to attract and has been attracting a lot of foreign investment and foreign interest in the state. Do you attribute this fall in manufacturing growth to the overall scenario in the country that has been going on since 2008, since the recession started? And also, would you agree with the view that if I were to say that the manufacturing growth that Gujarat has been able to sustain, it may be a little lower than before, but it's at that level because of this effort that is put in Vibrant Gujarat, etc.?
Not quite, because let me be a bit more careful and restate what I said. One is the absolute rate of growth of any sector, whether it is agriculture or industry or manufacturing or services. The other is the share of that particular sector in the state's gross state domestic product. In the case of Gujarat, what has happened is the manufacturing share in GSDP has come down marginally. The industrial share in GSDP has gone up because industry includes also things like electricity, let us say. And Gujarat is increasingly also becoming a service sector economy. Agriculture, when there is transformation in agriculture, some of this involves disintermediation. And strictly from the point of national income accounting, that growth does not show up in agriculture. So stated very simply and stated as a share of GSDP, what's been happening in Gujarat is whatever agriculture has dropped, half of that has been picked up by industry, not manufacturing, but industry, other components, and half of it has been picked up by services. But that's the share in GSDP.
Thank you. We'll take a short break of a couple of minutes and be back with your questions that you have either posed or are going to pose throughout this duration of this show. So welcome back everyone. Now we'll take some questions that we've got. Professor Debroy, one of the questions that we've got is that, with this FDI in retail and aviation, what will be the fundamental change in the economy, and especially with the 2014 elections in mind? Are they essentially a reform or an administrative action?
Well, the FDI part of it, whether it is in retail or whether it is in civil aviation, one has to be a little bit careful about. And I'm saying this because of various reasons. Firstly, if I take retail first, there are all kinds of obstacles that get in the way of making retail organized. And several of these are related to constraints that exist in the agricultural sector. There are constraints in the form of the APMC Acts. Gujarat, by the way, is one state which has repealed the APMC Act. There are constraints in the form of indirect taxes. There are constraints in terms of orders issued under the Essential Commodities Act. There are constraints that are because of various motor vehicles rules, all of those. So until we get rid of those, the true disintermediation in agriculture and the true transformation of the retail sector and the trade sector into organized is not going to happen. In this, to my mind, FDI is a very, very small part of the jigsaw. So yes, these represent reform, but in a very small sense, because FDI in either of those sectors, civil aviation is slightly different, but certainly in retail, FDI is a very small part of that story. More importantly, the way FDI in retail is being done today, for example, it is restricted to the million plus cities. If it's a good thing, why am I restricting it only to million plus cities? If it is a good thing, why am I not throwing it open to 100%? Why am I creating this artificial distinction between multi-brand and single brand? In other words, my perception is that this has been done because of lobbying on the part of, let's say, the US, and on the part of some Indian joint venture partners who can now sell off that equity at profitable levels to the ones who want to enter. So yes, the spirit of it is in the reform direction, but does it amount to much? I don't think so.
And also the fact that in the FDI in aviation, Air India has of course been left out of the gamut. So the airline which really needs influx of money where the government doesn't have.
Yes, and aviation is something. Aviation has its own peculiar characteristics. And I'm not very sure that except for two airlines, anyone is significantly going to gain from this.
That's right. That's absolutely. Well, the second question that we have received is that what things can change the Indian economy within the next 2 years, and what is a perfect strategy to curb this ever-menacing inflation that we are dealing with?
Inflation essentially has three different components. One part of it is the imported variety because of whatever is happening to global commodity prices, whether it's petroleum or other commodities. And if China and India go back to high rates of growth, that global upward pressure will continue. The next component is the manufacturing part. And the manufacturing part, I think the reason we are stuck with that inflation is because people are not investing today. And there are various reasons why people are not investing. Consequently, there is excess demand. So the answer to that is to remove the irritants that exist in the way of people investing. And finally, we come to agriculture. And I'm not getting into the specific numbers because the specific numbers are often point to point. They depend on what the inflation index was 1 year ago on today's date. Forget that. But as a general trend, inflation has been going up. I'm talking about food products. And the answer, of course, to that is to increase productivity, increase production. And that's where the Gujarat story is relevant, because one of the implications of the Gujarat agricultural story is the diversification that has happened. It is not classic crop agriculture that's growing. There's been an enormous amount of diversification in something like dairy. There has been an enormous amount of disintermediation in the marketing of produce, fruits, vegetables, dairy. So the simple answer is that if you want to do something about inflation, we really need to adjust the supply side. And finally, one reason for the inflation is the very high fiscal deficit and the high public expenditure, which has been pumping liquidity into the system. So we need to control this inefficient public expenditure.
One more question that we've received is with a comparison with an example from South Korea. How at the time of the Second World War or at the end of the Second World War, South Korea was a poor country, and in this short time it has risen to great economic heights. A major reason was the political will in South Korea laying great amount of stress and emphasis on infrastructure like roads and other networks. How do you see that the infrastructure stress that Gujarat government has been laying, can it lead to this South Korean replication of success, and do you have any comments on that?
The word infrastructure can be interpreted purely in terms of the physical infrastructure, which is the roads, the electricity, water that I've already talked about. I think these three are the most important. It can be also interpreted in a broad sense, which is the social infrastructure, the education, the literacy, the health. Let's get the facts clear. Despite Gujarat's growth, Gujarat is still a relatively poor state. The per capita income of Gujarat is roughly the same as the all India average. So this growth has to continue for at least 2 more decades for Gujarat to be even thought about, not South Korea today, but to be comparable with what South Korea was in the 70s. In the process of doing this, either I use my inputs more, and those inputs can be land, labor, capital, whatever, or I can begin to use them more efficiently, which means increase productivity. Today, Gujarat's growth has largely been based, because of the factors I mentioned, on labor, capital, land. Eventually, I think the emphasis will have to be on moving up that ladder if one is going to sustain that kind of growth rate and moving to higher levels of productivity. In other words, what I'm saying is that 10% growth rate may be reasonably easy for the next 10 years because they're slack, but beyond that, unless one moves to higher levels of productivity, that 10% growth rate cannot be sustained, it will drop to 8%. And I'd like to flag one particular factor, which is Gujarat is already beginning to face a labor shortage. Now, don't get me wrong, that labor shortage can be negated because the female work participation rates in Gujarat are still very low, not only at the level of the state but across all the districts. And it's perfectly possible that female work participation rates will rise as they rise in any process of development. However, increasingly, the point that I mentioned earlier remains, which is one has to ensure greater levels of productivity. And greater levels of productivity also mean not just education and literacy, but also mean and require skill development.
Vocational training.
Vocational training. And again, this is an initiative which we do not see the payoffs in terms of data yet. But this is an initiative that has been happening. Historically, the skill development initiatives have been in places like Kerala and Maharashtra and to a lesser extent in Tamil Nadu. But we have begun to see that happen in Gujarat, and therefore I'm somewhat hopeful that the labor/skills issue will mean that people move to higher levels of productivity.
Now, since we have a lot of viewers who are viewing us from Gujarat and all across India, I'll ask the next question in Hindi, and I hope you'll be able to throw some light in the same language. अगर ये मोदी मॉडल या गुजरात मॉडल जैसे कहा जाता है, उसको अगर हम नेशनल लेवल पे उसका एक अमलीकरण करें, तो क्या आपको लगता है कि ये रेप्लिकेट हो सकता है?
नहीं, बिल्कुल रेप्लिकेट हो सकता है. ये तो मैं पहले से ही कह रहा हूं कि गुजरात मॉडल खास कोई मॉडल नहीं है. ये मॉडल जो है वो हर राज्य में होना चाहिए, केंद्र में होना चाहिए. तो जाहिर सी बात है कि ये नेशनल लेवल पे भी बिल्कुल इंप्लीमेंट हो सकता है.
एक और सवाल ये है कि हमारे जो भूतपूर्व राष्ट्रपति थे अब्दुल कलाम जी, उन्होंने कहा है कि गुजरात का जो एग्रीकल्चर टर्न अराउंड था वो एक देश की आंखें खोल देने वाली जैसे चीज थी, तो ये भी क्यों नेशनल लेवल पे आप क्या मानते हैं कि क्या करना चाहिए तो इसको नेशनल लेवल पे भी हो सकता है?
ये इतना आसान नहीं है, ये इतना आसान नहीं है, बट लेट मी गेट द state the background clearly. We are still struggling at the national level to get a 4% rate of growth in agriculture. And here is Gujarat, which has grown at 9%. Why has it grown at 9%? It has grown at 9%. The roads already were good enough. It has grown at 9% because of electricity, the Jyotigram scheme, and because of water. तो मुझे लगता है कि इलेक्ट्रिसिटी का जो मॉडल है, ज्योतिग्राम मॉडल जो है, वो हम कहीं भी रेप्लिकेट कर सकते हैं, क्यों नहीं? मगर जहां तक पानी का सवाल है, इतना आसान नहीं है,
क्योंकि वो हर एक का ज्योग्राफिकल लोकेशन वगैरह इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर अलग है। एक और चीज आपने अपने टॉक में बताया था कि आपने पूरे गुजरात में आप घूमे और आपने एक जो चीज यहां देखी वो ब्यूरोक्रेसी की एम्पावरमेंट है, ब्यूरोक्रेसी की इंडिपेंडेंस और फ्रीडम टू वर्क है। तो आजकल तो ये भ्रष्टाचार का मुद्दा पूरे देश में छाया हुआ है, तो गुजरात कैसे इस भ्रष्टाचार पे कंपैरेटिवली काबू कर सका है, और क्या आप मानते हैं कि वो कर सका है, और कर सकता है तो ये पूरे देश में कैसे इसको किया जाए?
ये इतना आसान सवाल नहीं है। इसलिए आसान सवाल नहीं है बिकॉज करप्शन हैज मेनी डायमेंशंस। ऐसा नहीं कि करप्शन का मतलब सिर्फ ये है वो नहीं है। देयर आर पेटी काइंड्स ऑफ करप्शन एंड मोस्ट ऑफ द टाइम व्हेन वी आर कंप्लेनिंग अबाउट करप्शन एंड नॉट वाचिंग करप्शन ऑन टीवी, वी आर कंप्लेनिंग अबाउट पेटी काइंड्स ऑफ करप्शन। द आंसर टू रिड्यूसिंग पेटी काइंड्स ऑफ करप्शन इज टू रिड्यूस डिस्क्रेशन and eliminate shortages. Wherever there are shortages and wherever there is discretion, there will be the petty kind of corruption. To my mind, Gujarat has been able to reduce that petty kind of corruption. I am not using the word eliminate.
Correct.
I am saying it has been able to reduce that petty kind of corruption, and if one goes back and reads, one will find that in the year 1997, there was a conference of chief ministers. And in the year 1997, the conference of chief ministers agreed on a reform blueprint to eliminate petty kinds of corruption. अंतर क्या है? अंतर सिर्फ यही है कि बाकी राज्यों में वो सिर्फ ब्लूप्रिंट रह गया है, यहां कम से कम वो थोड़ा बहुत इंप्लीमेंट हुआ है. Now this leaves the bigger kind of corruption, and the bigger kind of corruption, unfortunately, is linked with the electoral system. And that, unless one does something about the complete overhaul of the electoral system, I don't think we'll be able to resolve that.
One question that has come, I don't know whether I should ask you or not, but since it's a live question, probably I'm tempted to ask you. And since on the lighter side I'm a lawyer, I would like to surprise you in your cross-examination, if you may want to call it. A viewer has asked that what are your views on federalism? And what would be, will Gujarat serve the nation better by sending more taxes to Delhi or cutting the rates? I think he's got the issue a little mixed up, but still federalism.
I have not understood the second part of it. The reason I have not understood the second part of it, no, first let me answer the first part of it. The fact of the matter is that India is too centralized. And I'm just saying this on grounds of economics. I'm not getting into the political issues because there are political issues like Article 356 and whatever. Forget that.
Correct.
India is too centralized. It was centralized historically by the British, and then post 1947, it has become unnecessarily centralized because of the emphasis on centralized planning.
Correct.
So yes, there is an issue of decentralization. There is an issue of decentralization, which is why the word federalism becomes more important. There is an issue of decentralization which is not just center to state, but also decentralization within the state. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but let me state it differently. One of the interesting things that's been happening in Gujarat is not just decentralization to the level of the districts, but also to the level of the talukas, or at least the experiment has started. But going back to the question, essentially we are talking about two kinds of transfers that happen in Indian kind of setups from the center to the states. First is through the Finance Commission, which is the right constitutional organ. The second kind of transfer that happens is through the Planning Commission, which is actually not a constitutional body, but it is set up through an executive body. But one of the implications of setting up the Planning Commission has been the powers of the Finance Commission has been diluted. And we have got all of these central sector and centrally sponsored schemes which have a very tight and rigid template. And unfortunately, that rigid template makes it very difficult for individual states to implement those programs because it is a centralized template. The difference between a state like Gujarat and a state like Jharkhand is that if I've got a problem with a centrally sponsored scheme, in Gujarat I've got the fiscal resources to plug that with a state level scheme. But if I'm a cash-starved state like Jharkhand, I don't have that fiscal space, nor can I readily create that fiscal space to plug it. So therefore, there is this very big issue of decentralization, and in my view, there is this very big issue of scrapping transfers to the Planning Commission, including the discretionary transfers to the centrally sponsored schemes, and routing all transfers to the Finance Commission. The reason I said I'm not very clear about what the question on tax means is in the tax reform agenda. All of taxes are going to be integrated into the GST. It's not clear yet what will happen to stamp duties and property taxes, but those two apart, everything else will be integrated.
So then there won't be issue. Yeah. And one thing, since we are on this topic, perhaps maybe I can add a sentence, or I'm tempted to add a sentence on the view of federalism and the Planning Commission. The problem with the Planning Commission, as you rightly outlined, is not only what you said, but in addition to that is that since it is created as an extra constitutional body, and it's not even answerable. It's not even answerable to the cabinet or to the parliament. It's only answerable to the prime minister. So it's virtually a one-man army doing the entire planning of the nation. So that's where it hurts. We've got another interesting question. Is that what are Gujarat and India both doing? I think you've answered it a little bit to enhance skill development, which is necessary if we want to compete with China in the manufacturing sector.
I would say that that question needs to be rephrased. And there's a reason why I'm saying that question needs to be rephrased. I think the question to ask is who is going to do that skill delivery? Is it going to be the public sector, which will do it through the traditional ITIs and deliver skills that the market does not want? Or will it be done through the private sector, which may actually manage the ITIs? But if it is done by the private sector, then that skill will have some bearing on what the market actually wants. And if I look across the world, I have models that do both. There are some countries where it's completely public sector driven. There are some countries where it's completely private sector driven. I think the answer in a country like India is because of the historical experience, the public sector delivery through ITIs does not work. So it has to be private sector driven, which as I said can mean private sector management of the ITIs. And again, without getting into the details, that's essentially what Gujarat has been attempting to do.
I think we'll let you catch your breath for a couple of minutes. We'll be back with you very shortly. We'll take a very short break of a couple of minutes and be back with you. Welcome back, viewers. We'll continue with our interaction with Mr. Debroy, and we have some more questions for you, Professor. Some critics of the Gujarat government have often said that Gujarat lags behind on the Human Development Index and malnutrition. How you think have these measures, these measurements moved over the last 10 years, and do they have a gestation period that is considerably long in time?
Yes, and this is a repetition of what I said earlier, but since the question has been asked, let me repeat it again. That when people make such assertions, they typically refer to the India Human Development Report, which was authored by the Institute for Applied Manpower Research in collaboration with the Planning Commission and last year. So they invariably cite it and say that, look, Gujarat's track record on human development is not that good. It doesn't do that well on education. It does not do that well on health. What people fail to notice is that the data in that human development report actually go back to the year 2004-05. And again, to repeat what I said earlier, that much of the Gujarat government's emphasis on the social sectors coincided with the 11th five-year plan, which is from 2007. And interventions in the social sectors do not lead to results overnight. So if one is going to judge Gujarat on human development indicators, one needs to remember, A, there is this time lag, and B, there is always a time lag between the announcement of policies and its leading to actual improvements in outcomes. What do we know today? Today we know that the number of institutional deliveries has sharply gone up. What we know today? We know that enrollment rates in schools has sharply gone up. We know that enrollment rates of girls in schools have sharply gone up. Do we yet know what has been the impact on infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates? Not quite. But I suspect that give it another 5 years and you will see that the increase in institutional delivery or the immunization programs will lead to improvements on these. You give it a few more years and I suspect that again, logically you will find that it's because of that enrollment going up, because of the dropout rates coming down, you will find that this goes up the ladder, so to speak, and you will find greater retention at higher levels of schools.
I have a question. I have been, of course, a resident of Gujarat for all these years. And one thing that I see that Gujarat has a natural advantage over the rest of India, apart from many others that have been highlighted from time to time, is the huge coastline of Gujarat. And ever since 1995 onwards, and especially in the last 10 years under Mr. Modi, Gujarat government has followed a very aggressive port policy in developing ports in the private sector, in the joint sector, and ports are supposed to fuel the growth over the next decade. What kind of vision do you see under this port policy of the Gujarat government?
So far, I have said that Gujarat has grown. I think it would be incorrect to ascribe it to any one particular factor. It always is a combination of various factors, and it's not just as if one particular factor has influenced everything. For example, Gujarat has always also been somewhat lucky. Gujarat has been somewhat lucky not only because of the coasts. Gujarat has been somewhat lucky because of the way the corridors have been through Gujarat. Gujarat has been somewhat lucky because of the way it got water. But this is not to negate that the Gujarat government has introduced schemes to tap those opportunities. Now you mentioned ports. In the year 1993, which is just 2 years after the reform started, the Gujarat government took a decision saying, okay, reforms opening up, now we need to do something about ports. There are plenty of other states which could have done this in the year 1993, but the fact of the matter is that Gujarat was the only one which did react in the year 1993. On ports, essentially the Gujarat idea has been, and that's understandable, is because some ports are sort of central government subjects. So let's focus on the minor ports, which are within the state.
Correct. The second question that you told me that you really don't like getting into specifics, but we've got a question from a viewer who has asked a specific question that has the Garib Kalyan Mela that has been recently held, ये जो गरीब कल्याण मेला हो रहे उससे ये एम्पावरमेंट ऑफ द पुअर हुआ है, और उसकी एनोलॉजी जो यूज की है कि ट्रांसमिशन लॉसेस, जो राजीव गांधी का स्टेटमेंट था कि वो 5 पैसे ही पहुंचते हैं नीचे, तो उस ट्रांसमिशन लॉसेस में क्या फर्क पड़ा है इस गरीब कल्याण मेले के?
नहीं, फर्क तो पड़ा है. प्रॉब्लम ये है कि इसको आप कभी भी क्वांटिफाई नहीं कर सकते हो. Because one of the things that has happened is, and this is corruption in government programs. One of the best answers to corruption in government programs, apart from removing the public monopoly and introducing competition, is to make people aware of their rights. So what these programs have done is certainly made people aware of their rights and given them avenues for grievance redressal. Now that's important. Because इससे आगे इसको क्वांटिफाई करना बहुत मुश्किल है कि पहले 15 पैसा हुआ करता था 25 पैसा हो गया, ये कोई भी क्वांटिफाई नहीं कर सकता.
As an economist, astrologer, I would like to ask you some questions. One of the viewers' question is, what can the youth of this country, which is the majority now, expect of Modi and Gujarat model in the future? What do you envision?
I'm going to answer this question in a slightly different kind of way. Wherever I have travelled in Gujarat, whoever I have spoken to, whether it is the bureaucrat, whether it is the average Gujarati, there is an enormous sense of pride in Gujarat. And again, this is an unquantifiable, this is an intangible, but this is particularly relevant for the youth. That if I can instill that sense of pride, if I can sell them a vision, then I think 25% of the battle is over. I can go on and say all kinds of things about skills and this, that and the other, but to me the most important thing in Gujarat is what I just said, that intangible, about communicating that sense of pride and about selling a dream and selling a vision.
Now the questions that I'm getting on live are more perhaps which I would have wished that I were to able ask the Chief Minister rather than you, because they are saying what next, what next. So let me rephrase those questions in a different view. As we are almost nearing the last 10 minutes of our talk today, maybe perhaps you can do a summing up as an answer to this broad question that I'm going to put to you. And that is that, say, for example, water and solar energy initiatives, the Gujarat government has taken some path-breaking steps. So what next is your vision where you want that this could be done by Mr. Modi or the Gujarat government? The second is in women empowerment, as you have said, that skill development in women is very important. You know, if you educate a man, you educate and you create a skilled person, but if you educate a woman, you educate a generation. So those kind of things. And also, on the general view of that job creation in India is what really is now the need of the hour when the economy is facing such a strong challenge, not just in India but all over the world. And overall, now that Narendra Modi is not only considered a leader of Gujarat but perhaps a future leader of the country, of the nation, in those circumstances, what is your general outline for him as his economic vision, not only for Gujarat but for the country as a whole?
I'm not very sure how to respond to that, because you prefaced all of that by saying that these are questions addressed to the Chief Minister, but you expect me to answer that.
You can always advise him.
If I look at Gujarat, one way to look at deprivation is to understand that deprivation is sometimes geographical. In fact, it quite often is, because certainly to the extent that deprivation results from lack of access to either physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, it's often geographical. I repeat that I am an outsider, I don't know that much about Gujarat, but having said that, my impression is that the benefits of growth and development have spread to historically deprived areas like Saurashtra, they have spread to historically deprived areas like the Danks, but the left out parts are still North Gujarat and Central Gujarat. So I would say that the next agenda for the 12th 5-year plan for Gujarat ought to be to address issues of deprivation in the north and the central districts. Something that I did not mention earlier, but let me now mention it, there has been a focus in Gujarat on 41 developing talukas. These are talukas which have historically been identified as deprived, and much of the attention has been driven around these 41 developing talukas. The fact of the matter is that some of these 41 developing talukas are now graduating out of the developing category status. So I think one should revisit these 41 developing talukas, revisit that list, and I'm certain that if one revisits that list, one would find more of the central and north Gujarat districts added to this 41 developing taluka list. In terms of the country, the broad message, as I keep saying, is of what is called governance, and by that I mean administrative reforms and administrative governance, which means getting the bureaucracy to deliver, decentralizing planning, and improving the efficiency of public expenditure, because in a country like India, it's not that we do not spend public resources. We spend a lot of public resources, except that they are frittered away. And therefore, that's the model for the country as a whole, that let us improve, and part of this has to do with civil service reform. Let us improve that delivery mechanism. Let us decentralize the planning.
One thing I would like to add, and perhaps if you have any comments on that, considering that recently in the news we had the Manesar incident of Maruti highlighted with the labor union problem and the strikes and the insecurity that goes with it. We have seen an absence of those kind of things in Gujarat now for a long time, especially under in the last decade. Not only that, even Gujarat, which was a communally sensitive state post 2002, has remained absolutely communal violence free for the past 10 years. We have general sense of security, as far as, and not just security of psychological but physical security, the crime rates, etc. in Gujarat compared to other states. What do you think, how has this contributed in the success of the Gujarat model? Is this something which is important, or it can be easily, controlled despite for economic growth?
No, this is very much a part of the Gujarat model, but this is particularly important. The law and order environment is particularly important in terms of attracting investments. And I don't mean just foreign investments, even domestic investments. The law and order environment, and plus things like roads and electricity, availability of roads and electricity, are far, far more important in attracting investments than fiscal incentives. And earlier you asked a question about fiscal incentives, which I forgot to answer. So let me mention this, that yes, Gujarat has done several things in the area of solar and wind power, but apart from the geography, these involve fiscal incentives. And I'm not very sure too many states in India have the fiscal resources to offer those kinds of fiscal incentives. But to get back to the other question that you're asking, that it is also the case that Gujarat has had far fewer problems with land acquisition. And I'm saying this in the context of SEZs. And one reason for that is historically Gujarat had already acquired large amounts of land. And some of it was also wasteland. So for many of these projects, you did not really need to acquire fresh land. And the last thing I want to mention, and it's an important point, so I thought I should mention it, although it's not directly linked to a question, is this is not just about large-scale industry. This is also about small-scale industry. And quite often, small-scale industry does not register. It does not register because there are procedural costs with registration, and it does not register although there are incentives and benefits to be gained from registration. Now, one of the noticeable things that the Gujarat data show on the basis of the 4th MSME census is a sharp increase in the number of registrations. And this is not something that's happened for every state. And the only reason this could have happened is that the procedural costs of registration must have come down. And the procedural costs of registration coming down also means that corruption of that kind must also have come down.
Well, Professor Debroy, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and on behalf of the Friends of the BJP and perhaps on a larger scale the people of Gujarat, I thank you for the time you have invested, and we shall look forward to your book which you are contemplating on writing on the Gujarat economic model and the Gujarat growth story. I will ask Pooja to felicitate.
Thank you. So I presume I get to retain the flowers.
Yes, you do.
As a token of appreciation.
Thank you.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, all our viewers, on behalf of the Friends of the BJP, thank you for joining us. Please keep your suggestions and comments coming, even some which we may not have been able to answer today because of the shortage of time. We were flooded with a lot of your views, suggestions and questions. We will pass them on to Professor Debroy, of course, and we will find out some mechanism to getting those answers on the net or so. If you are interested in what the Friends of BJP is doing, if you are interested that the Bharatiya Janata Party is a party with a difference and a viable option to what we are seeing in the nation today, if you support Narendra Modi for his re-election in Gujarat, please join the BJP websites or the Friends of the BJP. We will be very happy to connect with you. And on behalf of Professor Debroy, all of us here, and I'm sure millions of you all over Gujarat and India, we take this opportunity to wish Shri Narendra Modi a very, very happy, successful and prosperous 63rd birthday. May he continue to lead Gujarat and also India to a very, very prosperous stage that it rightly deserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think it went off well.